This video is going to talk about how monetary policy affects aggregate demand. So, monetary policy, we're going to mean like the Federal Reserve attempting to control the money supply. So, how is that increase in the money supply going to affect aggregate demand in the aggregate supply framework, right? And it's going to affect aggregate demand. It's not going to affect aggregate supply. So how monetary policy is going to end up affecting AD in this. Well, we want to look and see how that's going to happen. Well, AD is C plus I plus G. And I is investment. So for this story, we were going to have to look at the market for loanable funds. And the Federal Reserve, let's suppose that the Federal Reserve goes in and wants to increase the money supply. What the Federal Reserve would do is they would conduct open market operations. They would be buying treasury securities from banks, and banks give the treasury securities to the Fed. The Federal Reserve will give them reserves in their Federal Reserve accounts. Now, the market for loanable funds, let's say that was in equilibrium here before the Fed starts jumping in here and affecting the economy. Remember, in the market for loanable funds, the demand would be people who want to take out loans, and this would be largely businesses. And then the supply curve in this market would be savings largely. But if we want to think about, well, what happens when the Federal Reserve conducts open market operations? Well, banks end up getting extra reserves. When banks take in deposits, so in other words, when people go in and put money in their savings or checking accounts, they have deposits to the banks, and those savings, what the banks end up getting are reserves. So they get money, that money comes in, and it's first and initially reserves. When the Federal Reserve ends up getting reserve, when the Federal Reserve puts reserves in the hands of the banks, it's equivalent as if the supply of savings has changed, and as the supply of savings increases, because alternatively, you could get $1 billion in new deposits, and that would mean there'd be $1 billion more of savings, and that would show up in terms of shifting the supply curve of savings to the right, or the Federal Reserve could, in effect, give the banks the reserves the same reserves that they would end up getting to begin with from that $1 billion that would come in from new deposits. So there's going to be an increase in supply. So we'll draw this here in the market for loanable funds. The supply curve shifts to the right. We have an increase in supply, so we'll look and see what's the new equilibrium in the market for loanable funds. And well, the price, anytime you have an increase in supply, the price falls and the quantity increases. So the interest rate would fall from R1 to R2. And then the quantity of investment, saving and investment, would end up increasing here from I1 to I2. For our businesses that are looking to borrow, the interest rate is the price of borrowing. As the interest rate falls, then if a business had an investment that they were looking at before, and if they had to pay, like, say, 5% interest to borrow and try to fund this investment, maybe like opening a new location for their business or expanding their factory. If they were looking at it and they had to borrow at like 5%, they might think, like, okay, this isn't worth doing because we're not going to get enough of a return on this investment to make it worth going forward if you have to borrow at 5%. But if you can borrow for 4% or 3%, all of a sudden some investments that businesses previously were thinking, we don't want to do this, now they become affordable because the interest rate has fallen, and that's the price of borrowing. As the price of borrowing falls, well, the law of demand says that the quantity of borrowing would go up. And so this reduction in the interest rate leads businesses to want to end up borrowing more. We have an increase in saving and investment, most importantly, investment. Because when we come back to the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, remember the aggregate demand is C plus I plus G. Well, plus NX2, but again, we'll drop that here just when we're talking about fiscal and monetary policy. It's C plus I plus G. I is here. It's a component of aggregate demand. So when the money supply increases, the interest rate falls, we'll end up having more investment by business. When we come over here to the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, that means aggregate demand, investment is a component of aggregate demand, investment has gone up. The aggregate demand curve should shift to the right. We'll have an increase in aggregate demand. And that's how the money, that's how an increase in the amount of the money supply can end up having an effect here in the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. This mechanism by which more money leads to a shift in demand, and then it'll actually end up leading to more output in the short run. If you have the short run aggregate supply curve here, the shift to the right of aggregate demand, the short run equilibrium will move to the right, those will have a higher level of output. We're not going to show that here, but that would be what's happening. And what we see that money ends up more money ends up translating into more output in the short run. This is what's referred to by economists as the monetary transmission mechanism. How do you go from having more money in the economy to having more real quantities of real goods and services? And to understand that, we look in the market for loanable funds and realize like the increase in the money supply would be like an increase in this supply of savings. So allow for lower interest rates and more investment. Investment is one of the components of A&D, and that will increase or shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. If the Federal Reserve had contractionary fiscal policy, if instead of buying bonds from the banks, they sold bonds to the banks, then reserves go out of the system. There would be a shift to the left of the savings curve. Interest rate would rise. There would be less investment, and aggregate demand would shift to the left. So we're showing expansionary monetary policy here. Contractionary policy works through the same monetary transmission mechanism. It's the market for loanable funds. It's just in the opposite direction. Less money means higher interest rates, less investment. Less investment means that the aggregate demand curve shifts to the left. So that's how a change in the money supply can affect the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model.